I will search for the source text in the current directory to determine if this is part of an existing file. The most powerful army in Europe, annihilated by fog. How did a simple environmental trick decide one of military history's most unlikely victories? In the winter of 1475, the Ottoman Empire marched into a narrow valley, certain it would crush a small principality and open a path to Central Europe. They sent 60,000 men, heavy cavalry, experienced archers, siege artillery capable of bringing down walls in days. At the front marched the Janissaries, the imperial elite, soldiers who had never known defeat in open battle. On the other side of the valley stood Moldavia, less than 15,000 men, mostly peasants armed with wooden spears and simple bows. Their prince, Stephen III, was only 42, but he had faced the Ottoman Empire before, and lost, twice. His fortresses were damaged, his granaries empty. His European allies once again never showed up. The odds weren't just unfavorable, they were pure mathematics. 4 Ottomans for every Moldavian, superior in weaponry, in training, in resources. The Ottomans had conquered Constantinople, had devastated Hungary, had crushed every Balkan kingdom that dared to resist. This small principality shouldn't be any different. But there was a detail the Ottomans ignored, an invisible detail that was about to turn that triumphal march into the greatest military disaster of the century. Stephen knew he couldn't win in the open field. The Ottoman cavalry would flank them. The artillery would crush them from a distance. The Janissaries would break any defensive line he mounted. Conventional tactics meant death. Retreat meant losing Moldavia forever. There was only one option, but it required something no Ottoman army had faced before. The valley where he chose to fight was no accident. Stephen knew every slope, every frozen stream, every forest flanking the pass. He had hunted there in his youth. He had trained his troops there in the autumn. And he knew that, in winter, that place did something no other did. The fog descended upon the valley like a living wall, thick, cold, unrelenting. It wasn't the light morning mist that burns off with the sun. It was the kind of fog you find in deep valleys, where icy air meets rivers still warm, creating walls of white that cut visibility down to just 10 paces. And it lasted for hours. Sometimes, entire days. For the Ottomans, it was an inconvenience. It hindered the march, delayed the advance. But they had numbers, they had discipline. They would form their lines, wait for the fog to lift, and then wipe the Moldavians off the map. It was just a matter of time. Stephen saw something different. He saw a battlefield where numerical superiority didn't matter, because no one could see past their own hands. He saw a place where the Ottoman cavalry, devastating in the open, would be blind and vulnerable. He saw an opportunity to turn Moldavia's greatest weakness, its numerical inferiority, into a deadly tactical advantage. But for this to work, he would need split-second precision. One mistake, and Moldavia would cease to exist. But only if he could control the uncontrollable. The fog. He couldn't conjure it. He couldn't dispel it. But he could use it. And for that, he needed to rewrite every rule of combat the Ottomans knew. 3 weeks before the battle, Stephen began preparing the valley. He didn't build fortifications. He didn't dig trenches. Instead, he did something strange. He positioned small groups of archers on high ground, hidden in the forests around the valley. They weren't large groups. 5, maybe 10 men. But each group had a specific task: to know the terrain, to memorize every stone, every tree, every bend of the frozen river, to practice moving in complete darkness. Because when the fog descended, the valley would become a labyrinth for the Ottomans. But for the Moldavians, it would be home. He placed small cannons mounted on sleds hidden in the forests, so they could be moved silently and fired without revealing their exact position. He organized light infantry squads with simple orders. Don't face the Ottomans head-on. Appear, attack, disappear. Use the fog as a shield, the terrain as a weapon, sound as a guide. Every slope, every riverbank, every breath of the fog had been shaped for this moment. The Ottomans marched into the valley on the morning of January 10th. The sky was gray, heavy with moisture. The air smelled of snow and campfire smoke. They advanced in perfect formation, imperial banners fluttering above the columns, janissaries in front, cavalry on the wings, artillery in the center. A war machine that had conquered half the known world. They just didn't know they were marching into a tomb. Then the fog descended, not gradually, like a curtain falling on a stage. In minutes, the entire valley disappeared into impenetrable white. Ottoman soldiers lost sight of their own lines. Commanders shouted orders that were lost in the void. The perfect formation began to unravel, not from panic, but from the simple impossibility of maintaining cohesion when no one can see 10 paces ahead. The janissaries stopped, awaiting orders. The cavalry slowed its pace, wary. And then, out of nowhere, arrows began to fall. Not a massive volley. Isolated arrows, coming from different directions. One soldier fell. Another screamed. The Ottomans spun to face the attack, but there was nothing to see. Only fog. They fired back at where they thought the arrows were coming from. They hit trees. They hit rocks. Occasionally, they hit their own men who had strayed from the line without realizing it. Ottoman discipline held. They advanced, slowly, cautiously. And then they heard something that froze them in place. Cannons. Not the heavy artillery they knew, loud and predictable. Small mobile cannons, firing from positions that shifted with every shot. The sound bounced off the valley walls, distorted by the fog, making it seem like the fire was coming from all sides at once. Ottoman soldiers crouched, seeking cover in open terrain where there was absolutely no cover. And then the Moldavian infantry attacked, not in a suicidal frontal charge, in rapid, coordinated waves, coming from multiple directions. 10 men would emerge from the mist, attack an exposed flank, and vanish before the Ottomans could react. 30 seconds later, another group would attack from the opposite side, and another, and another. The Moldavians weren't fighting a battle, they were executing a hunt. For the Ottomans, it was sensory chaos. They heard screams, they heard gunshots, they heard the clash of metal against metal. But they couldn't see the enemy. They couldn't see their own commanders. They couldn't see where it was safe and where it was deadly. Every shadow in the fog could be an ally or an attacker. Every sound, a threat, or a twisted echo. The Ottoman formation, that perfect machine of war, began to fragment. Small groups of soldiers became isolated, trying to defend positions they couldn't identify. The cavalry, unable to charge on terrain they couldn't see, dismounted and fought on foot. The artillery was immobilized, useless without visible targets. Stephen wasn't just using the fog. He had transformed the entire valley into a weapon, and the Ottomans were about to discover that there was nowhere to run. The Moldavians knew every stone, every dip in the ground, every hidden trail. They moved through the fog like ghosts, guided by landmarks they had memorized weeks before. While the Ottomans stumbled blindly, the defenders struck with surgical precision. They identified isolated groups, surrounded them, eliminated them, then vanished before reinforcements could arrive. It wasn't a battle of brute force. It was a masterclass in environmental control. And the most impressive part? Stephen never had to risk a direct confrontation. He let the fog do the work. He let chaos break Ottoman discipline. He let the fear of the unseen erode the morale of soldiers who had never fought against an enemy they couldn't see. When the fog finally lifted, hours later, the valley was unrecognizable. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers lay dead or wounded. The imperial formations were in ruins. The Janissary elite, that supposedly invincible force, had been hunted down like animals on terrain they didn't know. The Moldavians lost fewer than 1,000 men. But as the Ottomans retreated, bleeding and broken, a burning question remained. What exactly did Stephen see in that fog that no one else saw? How did he turn a natural phenomenon that should have only delayed the battle into the most devastating weapon of the 15th century? Because it wasn't luck. It wasn't just knowledge of the terrain. Stephen had done something no commander had done before. He saw the fog not as an obstacle to be endured, but as an opportunity to be exploited. And what happened next would rewrite the rules of medieval warfare forever. To understand the magnitude of this feat, we need to go back to the moment of decision. The commander knew he had a single chance. A narrow window between the enemy's perception and reality on the ground. He gathered his most trusted officers in a makeshift tent, far from prying ears. What he proposed sounded insane to minds trained in conventional tactics. Use the enemy's heavy cavalry against themselves. Turn their superior strength into a weakness. One of the older officers shook his head in doubt. How exactly do you intend to do that? The answer came in a single word. Fog. The fog that covered the valley every morning wasn't just a meteorological phenomenon. It was a weapon. And the commander had spent weeks studying its patterns. He knew exactly when it would descend thickest. He knew how long it would last. He knew that, at that specific moment, it would be so thick that a man wouldn't be able to see his own hand stretched out in front of his body. And it was on this certainty that he built his plan. The trap was set. All that remained was to convince the enemy to walk into it. And what happened next was a calculated massacre. The fog trick worked in layers. 3 simple principles that, combined, would transform an overwhelming numerical advantage into a fatal disadvantage. First, neutralize the cavalry. The enemy's heavy cavalry was fearsome because it charged in compact formations, crushing anything in its path with sheer weight and speed. But horses don't charge into what they can't see. In dense fog, a horse naturally slows down, becomes hesitant, and loses the momentum that makes the charge lethal. A cavalry that cannot charge is merely mounted, vulnerable infantry. Second, create acoustic confusion. Sounds behave strangely in thick fog. Echoes distort directions. Screams seem to come from everywhere at once. Footsteps are amplified but impossible to pinpoint. The commander knew this. His men would carry drums and bugles not for communication, but for disorientation. The enemy would hear attacks coming from all directions simultaneously, when in fact they were coming from only one. Third, break the enemy formations. Armies of the time relied on visual signals to maintain cohesion. Flags, officers' gestures, relative positioning of units. All of this disappears in zero visibility. Units separate. Soldiers lose visual contact with their commanders. Chaos replaces order. And a chaotic army, no matter the size, is just an armed and confused mob. The final maneuver began the night before. While the enemy camped on the other side of the valley, confident in their numerical superiority, the defenders moved silently to predetermined positions. Not in a traditional battle line, but in small groups strategically dispersed throughout the valley. Each group had specific instructions. Attack from a designated angle. Use acoustic signals for coordination. And, most importantly, do not pursue. Attack, retreat, reposition, attack again. Small cannons mounted on sleds were hidden at the forest edges, covered by branches and snow. They could be moved silently and fired without revealing their exact position. The crew of each cannon had orders to fire a volley, drag the cannon 20 meters to the side, and fire again. The enemy would hear artillery fire coming from multiple positions, when in reality it was just 6 pieces constantly moving. Soldiers received instructions on acoustic coordination. 3 drum beats meant advance, 2 beats, retreat. A long bugle call, regroup at the primary defensive position. It wasn't sophisticated, but it didn't need to be. just precise enough to maintain some cohesion while the enemy had none. The commander was exploiting something conventional armies ignored. The enemy was overly dependent on visual formation commands. Officers shouted orders, but relied on flags and positioning to execute them. Remove visibility, and the entire command system collapses. A general can order an advance, but if the units cannot see where to advance, the order becomes irrelevant. The morning came with a light mist that quickly thickened into dense fog, exactly as the commander had predicted. He stood on high ground in the first few minutes, watching the whiteness engulf the valley like a silent avalanche. Within 15 minutes, visibility had dropped to less than 3 meters. It was time. The enemy advanced first, confident. Their heavy cavalry in front, infantry following in tight formation. But the formation fell apart almost immediately. Horsemen lost sight of each other. Infantry units slowed down, trying to stay close to neighboring units they could no longer see. Commanders shouted orders that got swallowed up in the damp white mist. And then the defenders attacked. The first blow came from the left flank. Not a massive charge, but small groups emerging from the fog, striking with surgical precision, vanishing before any organized reaction was possible. Enemy soldiers turned to face the threat, but attacked shadows. They stabbed the air. They screamed for comrades they couldn't locate. Seconds later, drums echoed from the right flank. The enemy pivoted in that direction, trying to form a defensive line. But before they could organize, bugles sounded behind them. Then ahead, then from the sides again. Sounds came from everywhere. The enemy army began to spin on itself, trying to face threats that seemed to be in all directions simultaneously. The cannons opened fire. A deafening roar tore through the fog on the north side of the valley. Enemy soldiers dove for cover, shouting warnings about artillery positions. Officers tried to organize a counterattack in that direction. But before they could advance 10 steps, another boom came from 30 meters to the east. Then another from the south. The enemy was being bombarded from multiple directions when, in reality, it was the same 6 cannons moving constantly. The heavy cavalry, the invading army's most fearsome weapon, became a liability. Horses panicked at battle sounds coming from directions no one could pinpoint. Riders tried to form up for a charge but lost cohesion in seconds. Some horses simply refused to move. Others bolted in random directions, crashing into their own infantry. A cavalry commander shouted orders to charge north, but half his unit went east because they couldn't see where he was pointing. Chaos amplified. Enemy units began colliding with each other in the fog. Soldiers attacked shadows that turned out to be comrades. Screams of pain mingled with shouts of confusion. The sound of metal against metal came from all sides, but no one could tell who was fighting whom. The cohesive formation of 15,000 men fragmented into hundreds of small, disoriented groups, each fighting its own isolated battle against an invisible enemy. Meanwhile, the defenders executed their plan with mechanical precision. Strike fast, retreat, reposition, strike again from a different angle. They knew the terrain. They knew exactly where they were and where to go. They used acoustic signals for basic coordination, while the enemy relied on visual signals that simply didn't exist. The turning point came when the enemy cavalry, in a total panic, charged directly into their own infantry. It wasn't intentional. It was just the inevitable result of thousands of men and horses moving blindly in a confined space. The charge massacred hundreds of foot soldiers. Officers screamed for them to stop, but their voices were lost in the chaos. Infantry units, thinking they were under enemy attack, counterattacked the cavalry. Soldiers of the same army began fighting each other, unable to distinguish friend from foe in the impenetrable whiteness. An enemy general desperately tried to reorganize his forces. He ordered a tactical retreat to regroup on open ground outside the valley. But the order never reached most of his units. Those who heard it tried to pull back, but collided with units that hadn't received the command and were still advancing. The attempt at an organized retreat turned into a disorganized rout. It was at that moment the enemy realized they were beaten, not by superior force, not by better weapons, but by an element they didn't even recognize as part of the battlefield. The fog had transformed their overwhelming numerical advantage into a catastrophic disadvantage. Every additional soldier was just one more person to get lost. One more voice screaming in the chaos. One more weapon that might strike an ally. When the fog finally began to lift, the scale of the defeat became visible. The valley was covered in dead and wounded enemy soldiers. Not in organized battle lines, but scattered chaotically, physical evidence of an army that had lost all cohesion. Abandoned weapons, banners trampled in the mud, riderless horses wandering aimlessly. The defenders had losses, of course, but they were minimal compared to the massacre on the enemy side. And more importantly, their lines were still intact. Their commanders still had control. Their capacity to fight remained practically unchanged. The invading army retreated in chaos. Thousands of men who had entered the valley with absolute confidence were now running for their lives, traumatized not just by the defeat, but by how bewildering it had been. They had been destroyed by an enemy they could barely see, by a weapon they didn't even recognize as a weapon. But this victory wasn't just about a battle. It was about proving a principle, something that would echo through military academies for centuries. That sometimes winning isn't about having more soldiers, better weapons, or superior position. It's about understanding the environment better than your opponent. It's about transforming what looks like a neutral variable into a decisive advantage. It's about making the battlefield fight for you. But Stephen's true genius wasn't just the victory. It was how he achieved it. The commander remained on the high ground as the fog cleared completely. He watched the enemy disappear into the distance, beaten and broken. But he wasn't just thinking about that day. He was thinking about what that victory meant, the precedent it set, the lesson it taught. Because when you change the way people think about war, you change more than battles. You change history. The valley revealed a scene that defied all known military logic. 12,000 Ottoman soldiers lay dead or wounded, scattered across the terrain like pieces of a smashed chessboard. On the defenders' side, fewer than 1,000 men. A laughable number, against 12,000. Let that sink in for a moment. An impossible victory. It wasn't a battle. It was a masterpiece of tactical engineering. The Ottoman commander, Suleiman Pasha, a veteran of dozens of victorious campaigns, stood paralyzed, staring at the wreckage of his force. This was a man who had conquered fortresses considered impenetrable, who had defeated armies much larger than his own. And now he was looking at the impossible. His elite troops, his battle-tested tactics, his overwhelming numerical superiority, all of it became irrelevant in a matter of hours. Because someone turned nature itself into an army. The Moldavian defenders looked out at the battlefield with a mixture of exhaustion and awe. They knew the plan was brilliant, but the reality exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. They had faced one of the most powerful empires on Earth and forced it to retreat, not with superior numbers, not with better weapons, but with something far more fundamental. With knowledge, with observation, with the courage to bet everything on an